let me update y'all on what's going on, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to have a conversation about this, all right?
President Joe Biden reversing a long-standing U.S. policy involving the war in Ukraine. Biden now going to allow Ukrainian forces to use long-range U.S. weapons inside of Russia for the very first time. CNN's Kevin Liptak is traveling with the president in Brazil. Kevin, what more are you learning?
Yeah, this is a major change in American policy, and it comes at a critical point in the war in Ukraine as Russian forces mass in the city and around the city of Kursk as they prepare for an offensive there, and as North Korea has sent thousands of its troops to fight alongside Russia in that conflict. President Biden making this decision to allow Ukraine to fire the American ATACMS missiles inside Russia for the first time. And this had...
All right, so let me give y'all a little bit of a history lesson. All right, and shout out to everybody in the chat. I appreciate y'all, love y'all, and the chat is my co-host for the day. So let me give y'all a little bit of a history lesson of why I consider Bush II and Clinton some of the worst presidents of all time. The reason why I consider them some of the worst presidents of all time is because Clinton, number one, sold out American manufacturing to China and overseas manufacturers, and so they front-loaded all of the wealth and made it seem like he was really successful as a president, but in reality, all he did was mortgage our future, and they kicked the can down the road. So now, what we dealing with in 2024, what they had in the 90s is they front-loaded the wealth, they sold out America, and then what we're dealing with in 2024, what Trump is having to do with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk and all of these cabinet members is undo decades and decades and decades of issues. So, for example, when you're talking about China and manufacturing inside of the U.S. and U.S. jobs leaving in the steel industry, that all was happening in the 90s and the 80s. And so what they did was they sold out manufacturing in order to say, and this is how they sold you, well, things are going to be cheaper and we'll be able to make things more efficient. Well, basically what they did was they eliminated American manufacturing and they got rid of a whole bunch of jobs. And so now you're sitting here arguing back and forth with me talking about where costs are going to be higher because, you know, they're putting tariffs on things. No, he's incentivizing manufacturers to come back to the United States of America and undoing what has been undone, you know, according to Kamala Harris, all of the issues that we did from previous presidents. Fast forward to Bush, the second one, and that's how I know being a C student, you could be successful because Bush said that he was a C student. He said, I ain't even tried school, all right? He was good at dodging shoes, but he wasn't great as a president. He's one of the worst presidents of all time, objectively, and I know that I'm a conservative, and I know that I voted Republican, but I have to be objective enough to tell you that Bush II, in my opinion, was one of the worst presidents of all time. And one of the ways that they was able to leverage people's emotions in order to stay in power was they literally became warmongers, and they, in my opinion, incentivized the United States of America to go into places that they weren't supposed to be in the first place in order to A, maintain power, and then B, somebody somewhere, a whole bunch of people made a whole bunch of money. So when they tell you that the Democratic Party is the party of war and rich people, they are not lying to you. And I think something much more sinister is happening here, but we'll get into that shortly.
Been the subject of a long-running debate inside the American government about the wisdom of allowing Ukraine this new capability. There were officials who were concerned about the risk of escalation in this war. That's something that President Biden has been concerned about throughout the conflict. You also heard officials worry about the stockpiles of ATACMS. These are not resources in endless supply.
No wonder Russia needed the Lord of War out of prison that they traded for Brittany Griner. No wonder they traded Brittany Griner for the Lord of War. So now we got somebody that don't even really stand for the American flag over here in the United States of America, and Russia needed their general back.
At the end of the day, the addition of the North Korean troops to this conflict certainly has created a new sense of concern in Washington about where this war could be headed. It's a subject of conversation that President Biden has had throughout his trip this week in South America. He discussed it earlier in Lima, Peru, with the leaders of Japan and South Korea. He also discussed it yesterday with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, trying to apply pressure on Beijing, to apply pressure on its largest, or on North Korea, which is China's largest trading partner, to try and convince Kim Jong-un that this was a mistake and that it could put his own troops at risk. But now this decision, I think, certainly for American officials, they do hope that it could help turn the tide in this conflict, but also send a signal to countries like North Korea that it sends its troops into this war at their own peril. Frederica.
All right.
Do y'all know what world war is, what the beginnings of a world war is? It doesn't happen the way that you think that it does. It's not going to play out with, oh, everybody is just going to jump into a war together. No, this is not even how it starts. It started a long time ago when we decided that we wanted to support through proxy meaning that, and the reason why we call it a proxy war is because we say that the United States of America has their hands and they're incentivizing other countries to have their hands in stuff that they should not be a part of in the first place, to the detriment of the world and to the detriment of the United States of America and its citizens. So now what we're doing is we're basically writing blank checks, running up inflation, adding to costs, ultimately putting our troops in harm's way and starting to incentivize and then creating anger towards us. So when J.D. Vance actually pulled up and he was on, I believe it was CNN or it was MSNBC or it was NBC, and they said, hey, why don't you look at Russia as our enemy? Don't y'all realize that is propaganda? They only look at themselves as our enemy because we're involved in things that's against their interests. And so what happens is J.D. Vance goes in and say, wait. That's a strong word. I'm not about to say that they are enemy. What I am going to say is they're our adversary, meaning that they're not people that we hate. They are people that have different interests than us, and so we have to have diplomacy. Diplomacy will allow for you not to plunge in a World War III because it's a zero-sum total, and the only people that lose is the American citizens because the people in power are still going to be there, right? And so while we was paying attention to whether or not they had Meg Thee Stallion on the stage or whether Beyonce was going to be out there endorsing Kamala Harris, J.D. Vance was giving you the news and he was saying, listen, we have to have diplomacy. We can't sit here and start to call Russia our enemies. And that's why the Millionaire Morning Show will highlight the ignorance, but champion the things that we really need to pay attention to when the information that you need in order to make an informed decision is important. While y'all playing identity politics, they playing war games across the seas, overseas, and giving money over to Ukraine and enabling them to have long-range missiles to make this more of an escalated issue than it needs to be.
When you know more. Thank you so much. Joining me right now is CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Layton. Colonel, great to see you. So first off, explain what these missiles are all about, this Army Tactical Missile System, or sometimes referred to as ATACMS. Talk to me about what they are, their capability, and why this is a potential turning point.
Yeah, Frederica, the MGM-140 ATACMS, as you mentioned, the Army Tactical Missile System, has a range of around 180 to 190 miles. And what it can do is it can attack things like ammunition depots, troop concentrations, logistical centers, all of those kinds of things that could resupply a front line. So what the purpose of this is, from the Biden administration standpoint, is to actually make it possible for the Ukrainians to prevent the Russians and the North Koreans from attacking the Ukrainian concentrations in Kursk, which is...
And you know what's so funny? Now you got North Korea giving Russia troops. China is more incentivized to attack Taiwan because of the semiconductor chips. Meanwhile, this is what J.D. Vance says, and this is why we have to do our research. J.D. Vance said this when he was asked by the same woman that was trying to give Trump a hard time at the National Association of Black Journalists. This is what J.D. Vance said, all right? This is what they said.
Do you see Russian President Vladimir Putin as an ally or an enemy?
Well, I think that he's clearly an adversary. He is a competitor. But I think that we also have to be smart about diplomacy, too. Just because we don't like somebody doesn't mean that we can't occasionally engage in conversations with them. And I think it's important, if we're ever going to end the war in Ukraine, fundamentally at some level, we're going to have to engage in some sort of negotiation between Ukraine, between Russia, between our NATO allies in Europe. And that's just a necessary part. Doesn't mean we have to like it, by the way. Doesn't mean we condone the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I think that sometimes you do have to engage in diplomacy, even with and maybe especially with your adversaries. I think the bigger problem, Kristen, if we step back for a little bit, of course, we're on the cusp, obviously, of a presidential election where I want the American people to select my running mate as the next president. Whether it's the cost of groceries, whether it's the southern border, and importantly, whether it's the chaos all over the world, I think really the theme of this election is that Kamala Harris broke things in the world, in the country, and Donald Trump will fix it. And if we get back to his steady leadership, it's not just going to mean lower grocery prices at home. It's also going to mean a much more stable and peaceful world.
When you say that he's an adversary, just to get back to the question, you're not willing to go so far as to call him an enemy.
Well, we're not in a war with him, and I don't want to be in a war with Vladimir Putin's Russia. I think that we should try to pursue avenues of peace. I'd also call China certainly a competitor, but we're not in a war with China either. I do think, though, that China constitutes the biggest threat that we have for the United States of America, and I think that we have to be serious about it. But I think we have to be careful about the language that we use in international diplomacy. We can recognize, obviously, that we have adversarial interests with Russia. We can condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I have, and of course the president has, but we also need to engage in some smart diplomacy if we're ever going to get out of the mess that Kamala Harris has left us in and get back to a posture of peace.
Thanks. Well, guess what, JD? They don't want us to be removed. And I also think that they are trying to sabotage the incoming president-elect, Donald Trump. But they don't want to engage in diplomacy. Do you know that Kamala Harris basically admitted that they've never even had a conversation in over 3.5, almost 4 years, 3.75 years? They've never actually engaged with Russia to figure out how it is that they can make sure that they remove them out of this situation so that we can end this. This has been going on for years now. Now we're using ATACMS. Now we've spent probably $1 trillion, and now we're using ATACMS.
Is the territory of Russia that Ukraine has occupied since August. So these missiles are designed to go in and to take out those kinds of things like those logistics installations that I described. And they're designed to do this in a very efficient, very lethal manner. And it's one of the most lethal weapons that the U.S. has in its arsenal. And if the Ukrainians can use it the same way that the U.S. would use it in a similar situation, then it could very much change the way in which the war is being fought right now.
So would there be conditions attached? Might the U.S. have said, okay, we give the green light to use these, but they do have to be logistical locations, like you just mentioned, logistical Russian, targets. Would there be any further guidance from the U.S. on how and what the conditions are in which to use these?
Yeah, I'm certain there is further guidance from the Biden administration to the Ukrainians on this. What they will probably say is that you can only attack those installations that are supplying the war effort against you in Ukraine or in Kursk in this particular instance. So the idea would be, Frederica, that they would go in and they would give them a list of targets that they can hit. The Ukrainians would perhaps provide a list of targets that they would like to hit, and then they would say, yes, you can use these weapons to hit those targets, or no, you can't hit those targets. One thing that would definitely be off the list would be nuclear installations or anything that would affect the strategic warfighting capability of Russia. That would most likely.
This is all bad. This is all bad across the board. It is bad, 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 bad.